Now, the government's facing criticism after plans to alter a ban on conversion therapy were revealed, leading to the cancellation of a landmark global LGBT conference set to take place in the UK this summer.
More than 100 groups pulled out of the Safe to Be Me event after a decision to exclude transgender people from a proposed conversion therapy ban was made.
The event, which was labelled as the UK's first ever global LGBT conference, would have coincided with the 50th anniversary of the capital's first official Pride marches.
It's now being reported that Boris Johnson is facing the threat of a Tory rebellion over the exclusion. Do you want to tell us more about that, Deanna?
about a rebellion,
yes.
Or about the situation more broadly?
She loves an old rebellion.
Oh, I'm not that bad a rebel, surely.
Any pork pies involved in this?
No pork pies as far as I'm aware, but... So I think effectively there's disappointment because it was promised, I think, sort of 4 years ago we first started talking as a party about banning conversion therapy. It was always said we'd do a full consultation, which has been done, and that this would apply or we assumed it would apply right across the board to the full sort of gamut of LGBT people. It was in the Queen's speech that this would go ahead, and then suddenly, I think it was early last week or late the week before, we heard that conversion therapy ban was not going to take place at all through legislation, saying that we'd explore non-legislative ways, which went against what we promised we would do and what we promised in that Queen's speech. There was then a very quick U-turn over this after, I think, quite a substantial kickback from quite a lot of Tory MPs. You know, I was one who got in touch with the Prime Minister and with the whips on this to say, we promised we'd do this, it's really important that we do. So then there was a bit of a U-turn, but it was only a partial U-turn, saying that the ban on conversion therapy would go ahead, but only for LGBT people and not for trans people, which not only kind of seems to go against what was promised, but also has led to this huge kickback by lots of LGBT sort of charities and organisations who then threatened to boycott the global LGBT conference that was going to take place in the UK. And so the government has scrapped the conference pretty much entirely. And that's where we find ourselves now. And
having spent £650,000 on it.
£650,000 of public money already spent on this, but also the amount of time that has gone into this from the officials involved who've been trying to get the organisations on side, and not just UK organisations, of course, but organisations and states all over the world.
Yeah, but back on the conversion therapy piece, Deanna, I think the issue for Christian churches, for example, is the fact that they believe the definition that is being proposed by some campaigners, maybe not by the government, but by some campaigners, is that it doesn't just deal with medical interventions or medical procedures. It also deals with praying, with preaching the gospel. And of course, that's of grave concern to them in terms of the freedom to be able to do that. So I think that's why you see institutions like some of our churches, Christian Institute, people like that, coming forward and saying they have grave concerns about the scope of the definition. I don't think anybody argues for conversion therapy to be available in terms of medical procedures, but there is a concern around prayer, private prayer and private counselling. So that's where they're coming from in relation to that.
Of course, and I think religious freedoms really kind of do need to be protected in this. But this is where it all comes down to the drafting of legislation, doesn't it? And making sure that the kind of whole wide range of views really are taken into account there. And I think my kind of argument on this is if nations like Canada, New Zealand, France can find a middle road that bans the most abhorrent conversion therapy whilst also allowing some of those religious freedoms to still be continued, allowing people to go and, talk to, pastors and get that sort of verbal support. If it can happen elsewhere, why in our country can we not find that middle ground through legislation?
I mean, I think the government made a mistake from the outset by conflating sexual orientation with gender identity, which are two completely separate things. I mean, the whole idea around trying to convert someone who's gay, I think, just seems a bit pointless, to be honest. I mean, I understand Arlene's point. There's got to be that religious freedom for people to have those sensitive discussions with people through their church or whatever.
Consensual, as long as it's consensual.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the important point of all of this, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I think when it comes to gender identity, I think it's a different thing entirely, because this can often involve medical procedures, for example. It can involve irreversible medical procedures, which if you undergo that when you're a young person, and you later regret that, then you're not in a position really to do anything about it. And the famous case of Kira Bell, for example, who underwent that sort of treatment and did come to regret it, and then later sued the clinic because she believed that they failed her in that regard. So I do think there's issues around free speech. I think there's issues around religious freedoms. I'm not convinced that a law on conversion therapy for gay and lesbian people is absolutely necessary, but I certainly believe that when it comes to trans issues, it's much, much more controversial. Yeah. And, you know, as a parent, if my child was going through, you know, that kind of thing where they were thinking about transitioning, I would want professionals to have the freedom to say to them, look, this is what it really means, and to have that sensitive discussion. And my fear is that on something like that, which is irreversible, we don't have that freedom, and I think that's a real danger.
I think my kind of pushback to that would be that those kind of spoken kind of therapies and counselling would still be available through sort of dedicated, trained medical professionals who'd be able to have those conversations, counsel people through that, because, you know, we know that gender dysphoria is a thing, particularly amongst younger people who are potentially going through puberty, struggling with their own sense of identity. It wouldn't ban that. It wouldn't ban those sort of therapies. What worries
me about that, I mean, you mentioned about gender dysphoria, Deanna, and unquestionably in recent years we've seen, I think, quite a dramatic increase in diagnoses of gender dysphoria. And of course we should have sympathy and compassion with people who are struggling with their identity in that way. But, you know, I just think that we have to have the freedom to speak to people, because there is such a thing as social contagion. And there is such a thing when you're a young person of following a particular trend. Now, I'm not saying everybody does that, but I would like to see some study carried out into the effect of social contagion on, for example, gender issues. And if there is that social contagion to a significant degree, then it is eminently possible that there will be a number of people in the future who said they had gender dysphoria at one particular time in their lives when they were young, but didn't have it later. And, you know, I've known young people, for example, who have said, you know, they're bisexual or they're lesbian, and a few years later they're not, and, you know, they're heterosexual. And of course, you know, when it comes to conversion therapy in terms of sexual orientation, that isn't so much a problem. But as I say, when it involves a medical procedure like gender identity, it can be a big problem later in people's lives, I think.
Well, I'm certainly hoping that we can find that middle road. And I think the thing about the sort of trans debate that I find the most frustrating is it pulls out the worst of both sides sometimes, and it gets incredibly heated, which makes it even more difficult to find that sensible, pragmatic middle road. And that's what I'm really hoping we can manage sort of in the coming months and years, is that we find that really sensible kind of approach that allows trans people to live completely freely in the way that they want, but whilst also, you know, dealing with concerns with people around sort of single-sex spaces. And I think we can find that middle road. We just need to find the will on both sides and take some of the heat out of the whole debate in order to do it.
Perhaps we should get the UN involved.
I think most definitely
10 years later,
not.
We're still here having this conversation.
Most definitely not.